Hi everybody. We spend a lot of time looking at events in JavaScript, how to listen for built-in events, how to have our event listener set up, and how to be able to react to things happening across all sorts of our page where the event is the common binding thread. Now in this video, we're going to go one step further. We're going to learn how to create our own custom events and do a lot of similar things, but in a world where the events are entirely defined by us. It's pretty cool, and we'll find out what makes them so useful in the world of JavaScript. So one of the things events really provide is they provide a nice level of decoupling between a thing that fires the event and a thing or things, the event listeners essentially, that listen for that event, which means that our code can be very flexibly defined where the only common thread between different parts of our app could be the primary event they're listening for and need to react appropriately to. So by relying on events, we have a great deal of flexibility in being able to change things around our UI and do a lot of things that typically would require a lot of maintenance and code cleanup and refactoring and making sure the name of a function matches the name of what we're calling and all that jazz, which we don't have to worry about. And that's what makes dealing with the built-in events like your clicks, your key presses, your page load events, your scroll events, or scrolling the page, makes all these built-in events so useful. But there'll be many scenarios where you might have your own custom scenario where you want to have an event fired based on, I don't know, let's pick an example. You have some data that you're currently manipulating, and once the data hits like an error condition or hits a certain threshold, you want to fire an event and make sure that whatever is listening to that event is able to overhear it and do all kinds of things to it. Now there's no thing in JavaScript built in to handle the custom event for your very particular scenario, but you do have the ability though to define your own event and do all the various event related logic that built-in events can do as well, except you get to define all of that yourself. And so that makes custom events really useful. The ones that we create and fire do all the things that make traditional events really great also. So this sounds really complicated, but it isn't if we kind of break it down into three stages. There are three steps that we need to think about when it comes to dealing with custom events. The first one is to create our custom event object. The second one is to define the listeners to listen to our custom event. And the third one is firing the event. Now, some of these things might sound very familiar to you because the overlap between what we're doing here and how we handle the built-in events when we look at events in general are very, very heavy in terms of what surface area is common between both of these worlds. So I'm going to show you a quick example and walk through how all the three stages, the three steps we looked at map to what we see here. So the first step is we are creating a custom event. And conveniently, when we're creating a custom event object, we can use the custom event constructor itself. So here I'm creating a variable called myEvent. Note I'm using the var keyword. Let is the cool thing to use right now. It's a slight typo. It should really be let. So I have my custom event, I'm creating it, and the name I'm giving my event is what I pass into the constructor. It is my event name. So you can see that I'm creating an object called my event. It's a type custom event, and the event I'm calling it is called my event name. Now, the next thing I do is I define my event listener. I can define my event listener anywhere that I want to in this case, but I'm defining it on the body element itself. And notice the name of the event that I'm listening for. It is my event name, the custom event that we defined earlier, and the event name for that. There's an event listener called do something that I'm going to call, and I don't really care if it's tunneling or bubbling, so I'm going to specify false. So this is our second step. We have our event listener specified. The third step, this is the part that is very different compared to what we might have seen before, is actually firing the event. Because in this case, we're not going to be relying on some built-in logic that JavaScript provides for the event to get fired. We're defining our own event. So we also need to define when this event gets fired. And one way to explicitly fire the event is by calling the dispatch event method and passing it the name of the custom event object that we created. So here I'm firing dispatch event on document.body, and the argument is the my event object we created earlier, which is really my event name. Now you can imagine how this code is going to play out when document.body.dispatch event gets called. The my event object is pointing to fires, which means my event name is now being fired on document.body. We have our event listener, which is the first line right here that talks about how to or what to do when that event is overheard. So you can see do something is going to get called, and it's going to get called just like any other event would. You have an event argument, you have like a type property. All these things come by default. They come for free because custom event really is it's an event behind the scenes. So all default event properties and parameters that make up your event are going to be coming along for the ride. So you get a lot of familiarity in terms of how to work with events, even though you create your own custom event object, never specifically specified these particular values to yourself. Now, with events though, you often have different properties that an event comes with. For example, you might have seen in the case of the mouse events, you can decide like which mouse button was clicked or the position of the mouse click and things like that. We have that flexibility with events that we create as well. And that flexibility is in the form of the detail property. And you can pass the detail property or specify the parameters that the detail property takes by specifying a second argument to our custom event constructor. So the first argument is the name of the event. The second argument is the object that we're going to be specifying with the detail property and whatever value we want to provide in it. So here we can see that we modified our myEvent object. We still have the myEvent name as the name of the event, but instead we're adding a little, an extra property for detail, and its value is going to be just a random number between 0 and 1000. So you can see that right there, math that random times 1000. And now you can see if we had to go back and modify our code, here's how we would use it. You can see that event, if you look at a do something, event listener, you can see event detail is, and you can see the e.detail property now shows up because the detail is something that we added as part of our event, the myEvent object definition. So pretty cool. Now, the detail property is great, but you may have many cases where you might have a lot of properties that you want to tag along as part of your event argument. For example, you could imagine that if you're dealing with the contact information, you might have an event that details the details when a new contact has been added, and that event might have properties for first name, last name, and various things like that. And so while you can't add additional properties directly to detail, you can't specify additional properties outside of detail, what you can do is pass an object to a detail property. And this object, of course, is your own object. So you can specify as many key value pairs of data that you want. Here we have an example where I do add a property for first and last and random to our object that is now passed in as the value to a detail property. And the way we can use it now is just like we saw before. We have our custom myEvent object with the detail property having an object of its own with first, last, and random. And if you look back at the event listener, the way I access this value is by just dotting into it just like I would any other property path. I have the detail property, and now the object is referenced by, in this case, the first property, which value is chalupa. And so e.detail at first gets me the value that I want. So it's a pretty straightforward way for being able to specify a custom event property on our custom event. Now, that is one big part of what we'll do with custom events. It might be one of the most popular parts of custom event handling in general. But there will be cases, though, where we'll want to kind of live in this hybrid world, where we want to fire one of the many events that JavaScript provides instead of creating our own custom event. For example, maybe we want to programmatically, that's the keyword, programmatically fire a click event on a button, or the DOM content load event on the document, a key press event on an input, scroll event on scroll, or an audio event when an audio is being played. Any event we might want to do, we may want to deal with them programmatically on our own. And so this really falls in the category that I could call triggering built-in events. So we talked about click, we talked about the mouse several times so far. So let's say we want to programmatically mimic the click event. So just taking a step back, if we just had to handle a click event just like we would have if we talked about events for the first time as part of the introduction, you would see something that looks like this. You have a reference to a DOM element, in this case my button, and you add an event listener that says clicked, and then you have an the function that's going to be listening for or reacting to the click event being fired. In this case, it's called something clicked, and then we have our something clicked event handler below, console.log, click event heard. So every time I click on my button, the something clicked event handler will get called. It's because of the event listener. Straightforward. This is what we've seen earlier, event handling 101. Now, here's where we're going to be adding our special flavor of newness to this. So let's say we want to programmatically fire the click event, fire it without having to have someone physically click on the mouse or do some kind of interaction that fires the mouse event directly. And the only, or maybe the biggest task for us is to create the custom event object just like we've done before, but instead of creating it based on the custom event constructor, we base on the type of the event we're trying to mimic. So in the case of click, we know it's a mouse event. So here I have my click event object, and I'm saying equals new mouse event, which is the overarching constructor for all mouse events. And the first argument is going to be which mouse event do I care about? Is it mouse over? Is it mouse down? Or in this case, it's really click, because that was the thing we're trying to recreate. And then you pass in the second argument, which will be an object. This object will have many things going for it, but the three properties it absolutely needs are view, bubbles, cancelable, and the values you'll typically provide for view is window, for bubbles is true, and cancelable is true. You can of course adjust these values as needed, but for what we're trying to do here, we don't want to get too deep into the weeds. We'll just leave it as these default values for now. And so once you've done that, if you go back and modify the example we just saw a few moments ago, notice that we have the first 5 lines are identical. I click on the mouse button with my mouse or trackpad or touch device, and the something clicked event handler happens. The last half of this code, though, you can see where we have our click event object that we defined earlier, but the last line is my button.dispatch event click event. So the same my button, the DOM element that we have earlier, I'm using the dispatch event method and telling it that this event is going to be fired on that element. Just like we saw for the custom events earlier, we're now doing the same thing, except we have a DOM element and the event we're firing is a default built-in event, in which case it's the click event from the mouse event object. And so when this happens, something clicked is going to be called, even though it's done entirely programmatically from the last line of my button.dispatch event. Now, what are the various properties though you can specify? Because we have view, bubbles, cancelable, great, but I might want to take advantage of the other parameters and properties that an event typically has. And for that, you have to look at the documentation. The documentation where you can see which event you're in and what are all the parameters that the mouse event init object actually provides beyond the default ones we looked at, which we saw earlier. So you have screen X, screen Y, client X, client Y. For mouse event, you might have a different one. For keyboard event, you might have a different one for page event. There are many events types that are there that you'll need to look at the documentation for and adjust your code appropriately if you want to actually rely on those custom properties. So for example, if you want to add the client X parameter to our events body and be able to pull it or basically read its value, our code can be modified to look as follows. Everything looks similar so far, where code will now have view, bubbles, cancelable, but you can then imagine that we're now going to have the client X property added to it as a value. And so if you look at what you see in the larger example here, you can see that our click event now has view, bubbles, cancelable true, but now client X, the property from our documentation from MDN that I kind of showed earlier, I added that property and it gave it a default value of 100. And now notice how I modified our event listener for something clicked. You can see the click position, and I'm printing out the script value of the client X property itself. Now, the interesting thing about the client X property is that because it is a built-in event that is populated by where our mouse is actually pressing the button from, if I click the button traditionally using our actual mouse or a touch device or a trackpad, the value for either client X will be whatever the position is. But if I do it programmatically, like I have in the example at the bottom, where it's my button dispatch event, the value will always be 100 because the click event in this case wasn't really clicked in a more traditional way. It was dispatched programmatically, and so the value will be the 100 that I specified as part of the default value when the click event object is created and fired on our mouse element. And so that's the last big piece of the event or a custom event world that I want to cover. There's one detail that we're going to look at in another example, maybe another video. Haven't decided exactly how I want to cover this, but in all of our examples so far, we've been dealing with events where a DOM element was somewhere in the page. It could have been a body element or it could have been a button. But in many languages, though, it is very common to use events as a way of signaling changes between various internal components inside our app. We talked earlier about the nice thing about events is that something can be happening one part of the page and something else can be listening for it another part of the page, and that reaction can happen without these parts of the pages having any knowledge of each other. That decoupling that we talked about is a really powerful thing. And in JavaScript, by default, out of the box, you don't really have the capability of firing events or defining events when a DOM element isn't really specified. If I'm doing something programmatically or something that has to do with like just some number crunching, I might be wanting to fire events for various parts of my application logic where there's no visual involved at all. The short story is that we can't dispatch events from non-DOM elements. You can't dispatch it from arbitrary objects that we may be working with. There are workarounds, and we'll look at that in a little bit, but just wanted to throw it out there right now in case you're wondering, how can I use the same logic on how to deal with custom events in a world where there are no visuals involved? So good news, bad news. The good news is that, again, we'll cover it later in a video or article. So there you have it, a deep look at custom events, both in a world where we create the event of our own, making up whatever we need to serve whatever problem we're trying to solve, along with the case where we want to kind of wrap a built-in event and programmatically fire it to mimic the default behavior you might see, where you don't have the ability to, for example, click on a mouse or do something with the keyboard or deal with the microphone, whatever kind of event you're trying to do. Now, you may be wondering, why would we ever do that? The custom event case from creating my own custom event, sure, makes sense. It has a great way of being able to handle our logic in a decoupled way. For mimicking our built-in events, there are some cases. The most common one is testing. You might want to test the functionality of your application in an automated fashion where you may not want to have someone physically click on each button or type in every key to see what happens, but you can fake it by using the custom event wrapping approach that we looked at earlier. And there are many other cases as well, just to simplify, having the same event listener be called for a lot of situations. So be creative. If you have any questions about this topic or any topic in general, post in the forums at formatgroup.com, where I and others will be happy to help you out, talk about events, talk about non-event topics, whatever floats your boat. Feel free to drop by, chime in, and we'll be happy to help you out. If you liked the video and how everything was covered, or if you didn't like the video on how everything was covered, tell your friends and enemies anyway. Hit subscribe to be notified of new videos that will be coming online. Follow me at Karupa for updates on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, wherever Karupas typically tend to be found. You'll find me talking about web development topics, so click subscribe or follow me to get micro updates on these various areas. And lastly, I also write books on a lot of topics you see here. Many of them are pretty popular. Many of them are very highly rated. I think right now all of them are highly rated. So check it out if you want to read this content or learn more in depth in either written form in a paperback or Kindle edition. There's got to be a book that I've written that will help you out. This particular topic on custom events is covered in great detail in JavaScript, Absolute Beginner's Guide. So if you want a deeper dive on that, that book is the one you want to get. And with that, I will see you all next time.